The autumn rain hammered against the basement window of the small house on Maple Street, creating a rhythm that had become almost comforting to James Crawford. He sat in his makeshift workshop, surrounded by tools, half-finished wooden projects, and memories that refused to fade. The cellar was his sanctuary, the one place where the ghosts of war felt a little less present. James was 34 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of someone much older. 3 years had passed since he returned from the European theater, 3 years since he traded his sniper rifle for a carpenter's hammer. His neighbors knew him as the quiet veteran who kept to himself, the man who never talked about the war, who flinched at loud noises and preferred the solitude of his basement to the company of others. Through that small basement window, positioned just above ground level, James could see the ankles and shoes of people passing by. It was an odd perspective, one that most would find limiting, but to James it was perfect. It allowed him to observe the world without fully engaging with it, to remain connected yet protected. His wife, Margaret, understood this need for distance. She had learned to read his silences, to recognize when the memories were too heavy, when he needed to retreat to his cellar and work with his hands until the trembling stopped. She would bring him coffee without a word, leaving it on the top step, knowing he would find it when he was ready. On this particular October morning in 1948, James was restoring an antique chair when he heard the voices. At first, they were just another sound in the tapestry of neighborhood noise, children playing, cars passing, the mailman making his rounds. But these voices were different. They carried an edge of mockery, of deliberate cruelty. Through his window, James saw 3 pairs of boots stop directly in front of his view. They belonged to young men, probably in their early 20s, and they were laughing. Not the genuine laughter of joy, but the harsh, ugly sound of people who found pleasure in making others suffer. "Get up, old man. You are blocking the sidewalk." James recognized the voice. It belonged to Frank Miller's son, Robert, a kid who had spent the war years safe at home, exempt from service due to a convenient medical deferral that his father's money had secured. Robert and his friends had developed a reputation in the neighborhood for harassing veterans, particularly those who showed visible signs of struggle. Through the narrow window frame, James watched as the boots surrounded someone sitting on the ground. An elderly man, judging by the worn, shabby shoes and the trembling hands that came into view. The man was trying to collect scattered coins that had apparently fallen from his pocket. "Please, I just need a moment. My leg, it does not work so well anymore." The accent was thick, Eastern European, Polish maybe. The man's English was broken but his fear was crystal clear. James felt his chest tighten. He knew that fear, had seen it in the eyes of countless refugees during the war, people who had lost everything and were just trying to survive in a world that had become incomprehensibly cruel. "What is the matter? You do not understand English." Robert's voice dripped with disdain. "Maybe you should go back where you came from. We do not need more freeloaders in this country." James's hands had stopped working. The sandpaper he had been holding fell to the floor. His breathing had changed, becoming shallow and controlled, the way it used to before a mission. He rose slowly from his workbench and moved closer to the window. The boots were kicking at the coins now, scattering them further across the sidewalk. The old man made a sound, a whimper of distress that cut through James like a blade. One of the younger men, wearing expensive leather shoes, deliberately stepped on the old man's hand as he reached for a quarter. "Oops. Did not see you there." The laughter that followed was monstrous. James felt something shift inside him. For 3 years, he had worked to bury the soldier he had been, to become someone softer, safer, more acceptable to a society that wanted to forget the war had ever happened. He had swallowed his anger, his sense of justice, his training. He had made himself small, confined himself to this basement, convinced himself that withdrawal was the same as healing. But watching through that cellar window, seeing injustice unfold at ankle level, James Crawford realized that some things could not be buried. Some things should not be buried. His hands were no longer shaking. His breathing had steadied. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt absolutely certain about what he needed to do. James moved with a precision he thought he had forgotten. He crossed the basement in 4 silent steps and climbed the stairs, each movement deliberate and controlled. Margaret was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared lunch. She turned when she heard him, and whatever she saw in his face made her freeze. "James, what is wrong?" He did not answer. He was already at the front door. When James stepped onto his porch, the scene before him was worse than what he had glimpsed through the window. The elderly man was now on his hands and knees, desperately gathering coins while Robert and his 2 friends formed a circle around him, kicking the money away each time he got close. A small crowd had gathered across the street, watching with the uncomfortable paralysis of people who know something is wrong but are too afraid to intervene. The old man looked up as James approached, and their eyes met. James saw everything in that brief glance: the concentration camp survivors that he had helped liberate in Germany, the displaced families wandering through bombed cities, the look of people who had survived the unsurvivable only to find that cruelty followed them even into peace. "That is enough." James's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The 3 young men turned to face him. Robert's smile widened when he recognized his neighbor. "Well, look who finally came out of his hole. The crazy veteran." "What are you going to do, Crawford? You going to cry about it? Maybe have one of your episodes?" The other 2 laughed. One of them, a stocky kid with slicked back hair named Dennis, stepped forward. "My father says you guys over there were all cowards anyway. Says the real heroes stayed home and kept the country running." James did not react to the provocation. He had learned long ago that men who needed to announce their bravery rarely possessed any. Instead, he extended his hand to the elderly man on the ground. "Sir, let me help you up." The old man took his hand gratefully, and James pulled him to his feet with surprising gentleness. Up close, James could see the numbers tattooed on the man's forearm, faded but still visible. A survivor. A man who had endured hell that these boys could not even imagine. Robert stepped between them, his face flushed with anger at being ignored. "You think you are some kind of hero, Crawford? Everyone knows you have been hiding in that basement like a coward for 3 years. My father says veterans like you are an embarrassment. You could not even handle coming home." Something cold settled over James. It was not anger, not exactly. It was the absolute clarity he used to feel in the field, when emotion became irrelevant and only the mission mattered. James looked at Robert with an expression that made the younger man take an involuntary step backward. There was something in those eyes that did not belong in a suburban neighborhood on a quiet Tuesday morning, something that had been forged in places where death was measured in seconds and survival depended on absolute precision. "You want to know what I did in that war you are so comfortable mocking?" James's voice remained quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made it more unsettling. The crowd across the street had grown larger. Margaret had appeared on the porch, her hand covering her mouth. Robert tried to maintain his bravado, but his voice wavered slightly. "I do not care what you did. That was then. This is now, and right now you are just a washed-up nobody who is afraid of his own shadow." James turned to the elderly man beside him. "Sir, what is your name?" The old man's voice was barely a whisper. "Stanislaw. Stanislaw Kowalski." "Mr. Kowalski, would you do me the honor of having coffee at my home? My wife makes excellent coffee, and I think we both could use some." Stanislaw nodded, tears forming in his eyes at this simple act of human kindness. James placed a protective hand on the old man's shoulder and began guiding him toward his house. Dennis, emboldened by Robert's earlier aggression, made a critical mistake. He grabbed James's arm. "We are not done here, old man. You do not just walk away from us." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but to everyone watching, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. James's free hand moved with blinding speed. He did not punch, did not strike, but somehow Dennis found himself face down on the sidewalk, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that suggested any resistance would result in a broken bone. James had not even changed his expression. He held Dennis there effortlessly, as if restraining a struggling child, while continuing to support Stanislaw with his other arm. If you are still following this story and want to see what happens next, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. What James does in the next few minutes will change everything, and trust me, you do not want to miss how this unfolds. James released Dennis, who scrambled away clutching his arm. Robert and the third friend had gone pale, suddenly realizing they had badly miscalculated who they were dealing with. "The police will hear about this," Robert stammered. "That was assault." James finally smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then tell them. Tell them everything. Tell them how 3 grown men were attacking an elderly Holocaust survivor on a public sidewalk. Tell them how a disabled veteran intervened. Please, make that call. I will wait right here." Robert said nothing. The fight had gone out of him completely. Inside the Crawford home, Margaret had prepared coffee and set out fresh bread with butter. Stanislaw sat at the kitchen table, still trembling slightly, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug. James sat across from him, and for the first time in 3 years, he began to talk about the war. "I was a sniper, Mr. Kowalski. British Army, attached to American units during the final push into Germany. My specialty was long-distance reconnaissance and elimination of high-value targets." Stanislaw looked up, understanding flickering in his eyes. "You were one of the liberators." James nodded slowly. "We reached Buchenwald in April of 1945. I had seen combat, seen death, thought I had seen the worst humanity could offer. I was wrong. What we found there changed something fundamental in me." He paused, his jaw tightening with the memory. There were SS officers trying to escape in civilian clothes. They thought if they could blend in with the displaced persons, they would get away. My commanding officer told me we had orders to let the proper authorities handle it, to follow protocol. "What did you do?" Stanislaw asked quietly. James met his eyes. "I followed a different protocol. The one that said some men do not deserve the mercy of a trial. I had a perfect angle from a cellar window in a destroyed building near the camp perimeter. I could see everything, every coward trying to slip away. In 9 minutes, I dropped 11 of them. Clean shots, no mistakes, no innocents caught in the crossfire." Margaret had stopped moving. She had never heard this story, never known the specifics of what her husband had done during those final days of the war. "My superiors were furious," James continued. "They said I had violated orders, that I had acted outside the rules of engagement. They threatened court-martial. But then the survivors started talking. They identified every single man I had shot. Every one of them was responsible for murders, for torture, for unspeakable crimes. The investigation was quietly dropped, but I was sent home early. They said my methods were too aggressive for peacetime operations, that I could not be trusted to follow proper channels." He laughed bitterly. "They banned me from ever serving in an active combat role again. Said I was too willing to make my own judgments about who deserved to live and who deserved to die. Maybe they were right. Maybe that makes me dangerous. But when I saw those boys hurting you today, when I saw them mocking your pain, I realized something." James leaned forward, his voice gaining strength. "I spent 3 years hiding in my basement, trying to become someone harmless, someone who would not make people uncomfortable. But harmless is not the same as good. Sometimes good men need to be dangerous to the right people." The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, the story had been told and retold, each version slightly different but all arriving at the same conclusion. James Crawford was not the broken man people had assumed him to be. He was something far more complex, far more capable. Robert Miller's father arrived at the Crawford home just before sunset. Frank Miller was a large man, used to getting his way through intimidation and money. But when James opened the door, Frank's prepared speech died in his throat. Mr. Miller. James's tone was perfectly polite. What can I do for you? Frank cleared his throat. My son says there was an incident today. Says you assaulted his friend Dennis. James nodded calmly. Your son and his friends were kicking an elderly Holocaust survivor while he tried to collect coins from the sidewalk. When Dennis physically grabbed me, I restrained him using non-lethal force. No injuries were sustained. There were approximately 20 witnesses. Would you like me to provide their names? Frank's bluster deflated. Look, Crawford, the boys were just fooling around. You know how young men are. There is no need to make this into something bigger. Stanislaw appeared behind James in the doorway. He had been staying with the Crawfords since the incident, too shaken to return to his small apartment alone. Frank's eyes widened when he saw the numbers on the old man's arm. Your son told me that veterans like me are an embarrassment, James said quietly. He said we are cowards. He mocked a man who survived death camps while he sat safely at home during the war. So let me be very clear about something, Mr. Miller. I do not want an apology. I do not want your money. What I want is for you to teach your son that strength is not found in cruelty, and that the truly dangerous men in this world are not the ones you need to fear, they are the ones you need to become worthy of. Frank opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his son, who had been waiting in the car, watching through the window. For the first time, Frank seemed to really see the cowardice in Robert's posture, the way he hid behind his father's influence. He will apologize, Frank said finally. To both of you. And he will do community service at the Veterans Center downtown. I will make sure of it. James shook his head. I do not want forced apologies. I want him to understand. But if he ever, and I mean ever, threatens or harasses another person in this neighborhood, especially a veteran or immigrant, there will not be a conversation. There will be consequences. Do we understand each other? Frank nodded slowly. We understand. As the Millers left, Margaret wrapped her arms around James from behind. You came back, she whispered. Not from the war. But from wherever you have been hiding these past 3 years. You finally came back. 2 years later, the basement workshop on Maple Street had transformed into something entirely different. The cellar window that once represented James Crawford's isolation now served as the entrance to a thriving community space. What started as one veteran helping one survivor had grown into something neither man could have anticipated. The Crawford Community Center, as it was now officially known, occupied not just the basement but the entire first floor of what had been a modest family home. James and Margaret had sold their house and used the money, combined with donations from veterans organizations and immigrant support groups, to purchase a larger building downtown. But they kept the original cellar window, mounted on the wall as a reminder of where it all began. Stanislaw Kowalski had become James's closest friend and business partner. Together, they ran programs for veterans struggling with post-war adjustment and immigrants navigating their new lives in America. The old Polish man had a gift for understanding trauma, for recognizing when someone needed space and when they needed community. James no longer hid from his past. He spoke at high schools about the realities of war, not glorifying it but not diminishing it either. He taught young men and women about the difference between strength and cruelty, about how the hardest battles are often the ones fought after coming home. Robert Miller had indeed changed, though not in the way anyone expected. After 6 months of mandatory community service at the center, he had asked to stay on as a volunteer. He never became close with James, the shame of that day remained too heavy, but he dedicated himself to helping others avoid the mistakes he had made. He married a social worker and together they opened a youth mentorship program focused on teaching empathy and civic responsibility. On the 2nd anniversary of the incident, a ceremony was held at the center. The mayor presented James with a community service award, but James deflected the attention to Stanislaw and to all the survivors and veterans who had built the program together. That evening, as James locked up the center, He paused at the preserved cellar window. Margaret joined him, slipping her hand into his. You know what I see when I look at that window now? James asked. What? Not a hiding place. A perfect vantage point. Sometimes you need to see the world from an unusual angle to understand what needs to be done. Margaret smiled. The sniper's perspective. James laughed. Something like that. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and the power of standing up for what is right, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your own stories in the comments about times when you or someone you know chose courage over comfort. Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages. Thank you for watching until the end. Until next time, remember that the most important battles we fight are often the ones closest to home.